Now, what will be the perspective from governments?
Thank you so much, and good morning, distinguished participants and colleagues here in the room with lots of not very familiar faces, so it seems the audience is quite varied, which is different from what we're used to here in the human rights setting. And the task was a bit easy when you first started to talk, but as the speakers started putting more information, it's becoming more difficult. But what appears very visible from all of this is that it is a very and highly cross-cutting issue. So we've discussed a wide array of input from various perspectives, and it seems everybody is involved. And it's the delineation of responsibilities, how everybody is going to take stock of what they are doing on the ground to integrate and embed that I would use the two verbs or concepts that have been raised here. Also, the keyword seems to be the capacity building. And I would come from the latest resolution by the Council, which took part from the report of the Secretary General and the recommendation to have some sort of a global fund on this issue. And the latest resolution from the Council from the September session 21/5 is expecting some sort of input from the forum in addition to the working group and other stakeholders on the feasibility of having some sort of a global fund to fund capacity building. But I believe that we need at first to define what we mean by capacity building in this perspective, because as it appears on the ground, the guiding principles as they stand now, they are in the process of dissemination, of awareness raising. There are lots of businesses, especially when you speak about the national level, the small and medium-sized enterprises, and how those can be adapted to their needs, because the guiding principles are general enough to address all types of business operations, but also this puts a challenge in terms of implementation, because as far as they are general, they have to be tailored in terms of implementation to be more specific to the country context and to the type of business itself. So this has to be defined before we engage on how we're going to fund the capacity building. We need to know what capacities we need to raise in the first instance. And another problematic relating to this, and it's mentioned in the report and brushed over in the interventions here, is the interpretation of the guiding principles now. What was termed in the report as sort of a fragmentation. And I would look into what UNICEF is doing as a sample of what the UN is engaging in, and the focus on children's rights in this regard. Is this a fragmentation or an adaptation of the guiding principles to children's rights? So we have to make sure. I'm not saying that they are a fragmentation because I haven't looked into the details of what guidance the UNICEF is doing in this regard, but there is a risk that it might lead to fragmentation of the guiding principles in terms of implementation and cutting them across human rights. Also, what was mentioned in the report, and maybe there wasn't enough time to address here, was the idea of having some sort of a database to collect information on the implementation, the existing capacities, the lessons learned, the experiences, and the gaps, maybe in implementation, maybe also in protection gaps. And this is an interesting idea, and maybe it needs further discussion in the future, maybe within the working group as well, in consultation with the states, because at the end of the day, you'll collect information from everybody, all stakeholders, and this involves the states. So when we're speaking, I'll go back to the funding issue, and when we're speaking about the establishment of partnerships, and how this also might lead to some sort of fragmentation or might lead to some sort of focus on certain areas rather than others, because it depends on how the partnerships are being established and how far the influence is going to be by businesses versus states versus other stakeholders in this process if we have some sort of a partnership in this area. And I know there are experiences within the UN system, like Lenny mentioned, the Gavi, for example, the Gavi Alliance, and other ones, the Global Fund on Malaria, I guess, as well. So we have to balance this out when we're establishing some sort of a partnership in this area. And I wonder if the participation, the sheer number of participation, especially from the business community here, is out of solely interest in this process, or is it also some sort of a fear that we're going to at some point in time, impose further standards on them, because as far as it stands now, it's some sort of a passive responsibility. It's the responsibility to do no harm and to respect human rights, as it stands for the time being. But I'll stop at another phrasing that was used yesterday and today, and maybe it's not there explicitly in the guiding principles, that it's not only respect, it's respect and support to human rights. And this maybe needs further exploration on how they are going to support human rights and how far this involves direct engagement with states or with stakeholders on the ground, especially when it relates to, for example, and this was mentioned in the report on part of the UN work on conflict situations or post-conflict situations. So where do you put the borderline between respect and the support for human rights, and how this is going to play itself on the ground? I'll just move shortly to the Global Compact, and I'm glad that we've had a clear perspective of how the Compact is functioning, and it's also really reassuring to see that there is some sort of a UPR or quasi-treaty-like reporting obligation on those who voluntarily signed themselves up to the Global Compact, and there is a mechanism to address non-compliance. But as mentioned by Sir Moody Stewart here, that the number is not really that big. We listen to the number and it appears big, but in real terms it's not really that big. So what is done to engage more from the business community and to bring them into the Global Compact, and how the Global Compact is working now on the ground, because it started before we had the guiding principles, and it had its own principles a long time. So how is it aligning itself now to the guiding principles, and how is it coordinating its role? Because the main role of the dissemination and sort of looking into the implementation of the guiding principles is the working group. So how far the coordination and the aligning of the work of the Global Compact is done with the working group on the ground to ensure that there is some sort of synchronization rather than fragmentation, again, of the idea of principles on business and human rights. If I go also to the Global Compact, there seems to be more of a focus on certain groups: women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and there's no problem in focusing on groups. But more this leans more towards social and maybe cultural rights, but the economic perspective might be lost in the middle. In this sense, you would provide more input. Maybe this is the impression I got, but there needs to be more of a holistic approach or perspective to the nature of human rights and how they should be addressed. And I believe it's taken up, as you mentioned, Sir Stewart, that human rights is not easy to grasp within the Global Compact, and they are not really comfy going into this area. And it seems other parts of the UN system, when it relates to the development agenda, the at-large development agenda, if you look at the work of the UNDP or UNCTAD or other fora within the UN that tackle development issues, they are not really still made aware of the guiding principles, and they are not really aware of how they should be incorporated, into their work. So I think I'll stop now. I've tackled lots of questions that I had in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker is Alexandra Waketa from the UN Working Group.
Thank you very much. I've been special procedures mandate holder for a year, and this is my first experience inside the UN. I had been outside the UN interacting with in various capacities. I've had experience, I've worked for the private sector and for think tanks before. Now, I have to say that one thing that I find daunting, and that is clearly evidenced in all the things that we heard, is the vast amount of agencies the UN has, right? So I can see in the back of the room others. If we had another hour, they would be sitting here in the panel as well. World Bank, UNCTAD, UNEP-FI, maybe I see somebody from the ILO. So clearly the issue of coordinate, so there's a lot of potential in the UN, and unlocking all that potential of the UN system and the UN agencies to take forward the guiding principles is very obvious. We will be able to take advantage of all those platforms offered there. The coordination challenges are huge, and I don't know whether all of you have given thought to this, but I think that maybe a high-level task force of people together to think about the guiding principles collectively, as opposed to everybody in their own office or their own agency, would I think help coordination. And I also think that it would help build a common view of the system. I don't think that everybody needs to do exactly the same thing. Clearly, agencies will have differentiated and specialized issues and roles. But I think that the UN will have to digest the different issues of business and human rights, the details of the guiding principles. We're just starting. We're just starting to understand and envisage exactly what the interplay between the three pillars are: the state duty to protect, corporate responsibility to respect, and access to remedy. And as we do that, then the UN, I think, will need to refine its understanding on this. Now, I also think, and I say it, looking a little bit as an outsider and a person that has been working in the space of business and human rights with different hats, talking to civil society organizations, advocacy groups, trade unions, corporations, domestic and multinational, and governments as well. And it's a difficult space, and it'll be very hard, I think. It's important to keep everybody on board. There's still fragmentations in this field. There's still distrust from civil society to people that work with companies, and vice versa. So I think that a key view or a key goal for the practitioners in this space will be to make sure that we keep the different actors on board and in agreement with at least a minimum common platform, and the guiding principles provide that minimum expectation from companies and states. Now, the other challenge that I see is that the guiding principles have brought business onto the agenda and to the forefront. And we've all been focusing on corporate, what due diligence means for corporations. But it also has Pillar 1. It also has the states. And we haven't talked much about all the range of issues, of possibilities, of actions that states will have, and responsibilities, indeed legal responsibilities. And that will be a political challenge. It will be a political challenge. And I think that that's part of the theme of making sure we keep everybody on board, states on board, as we start having more detailed conversations and nuanced conversations with them as to their responsibilities, as we go deeper into the responsibilities, into unpacking what the UNGPs means for corporations, and also as we look at the actions of civil society. But I guess that my main message is coordination, a lot of efforts, I think, to keep a center within the UN system, avoid fragmentation within the UN system. I think we need, I don't think we have even had time to have enough coordination between the working group and the Global Compact. I think I talked to them far more when I was not a special procedures mandate holder. No, I think we're too busy, but that needs to happen. And then again, making sure we keep everybody, civil society, business, and states on board in a common platform. There will be people that are not interested in this. There are people that are not interested in the guiding principles, and I guess that the guiding principles should unite us.
Thank you very much. We have now 20 minutes for interaction with the audience. Let me call first, I think there is a colleague from UNEP who has registered on this form, and maybe I will call on her to give her contribution from.
Thank you. I would like to echo the remark of Mrs. Lene Wendland in the beginning, saying that the guiding principles, they should have a broader interpretation to include also social, environmental, and governance issues. And I'm saying this from the perspective of the UNEP Finance Initiative, who is basically the partnership between the UN and the finance community, looking at the integration of ESG aspects in financial decision making. So having this broader interpretation would facilitate a lot having such institutions on board as UNEP-FI, because at the moment we have a working group on human rights, but we always find it quite challenging to justify the work, the term on human rights, because it's not directly part of the UNEP mandate. And it's really a handicap for us, because we are looking at sustainability as a whole. And the finance community, when they adhere to us, it's the corporate social responsibility that includes also environmental issues, which are so closely interlinked with human rights. We're having a working group on water rights as well, which is part of human rights. So that's I think one of our concerns, and it would be easier to have UNEP-FI at events like this, because I realize there is a session on public finance, there is a session on private finance, and this is what we do basically, and we're kind of one of the absent actors in the room precisely because of this mandate issue. And the second was a comment actually for Mrs. Asia, and I don't see your family name. Yes, on the principles, the children's rights and business principles, on whether you have a formal procedure of adhering to the principles for businesses, and whether you are monitoring on who is doing what, and actually what is the finance community engagement into these principles, because I think we have a lot of synergies there.
Sure.
Thank you.
So in terms of kind of compliance with the principles or something like that, there is no such thing. So what we decided to do, and there was a lot of discussion about this while the principles were being drafted, but in the spirit of the UN guiding principles, we kind of determined that it's the communication and the reporting which actually justifies saying that you endorse the principles. It's not about a tick in the box or something similar. So that really is what we promote, the active reporting and communicating on these aspects. And in terms of the financial community, actually the financial industry is one of the key industries that we engage with, and we've engaged with quite a number of financial institutions from the UNPRI group, and we have also institutional investors who are already very much actively involved, and some ESG research partners. So FTSE4Good, for instance, is currently already doing some research in this area. And a tool which I didn't actually mention in the presentation because I focused on companies really is something that we've developed together with the financial industry and ESG research houses, which is being tested now, is for external assessments, CSR assessments specifically on children's rights within the context of CSR, and we hope that tool is going to be used by research houses and academia as well to provide more tangible evidence of materiality of children's rights.
Thank you. Can I call on Iris Kimberley from Human Rights Advocates? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Kimberly Irish, and I represent Human Rights Advocates. We're an NGO based in the United States. We're dedicated to promoting and protecting international human rights in the US and abroad, and one of our focus issues is corporate accountability. I have a question for the panel, particularly Ms. Guaqueta. Given that the working group mandate is somewhat limited, mainly to dissemination, promoting good practices, and support of the guiding principles, what steps do you think that the working group can take within the UN system to move toward greater accountability for corporations that commit human rights abuses? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I call on Kathleen Hagen from GSA?
Thank you, Mrs. Hane. My name is Catherine Hagen with the Global Social Observatory based here in Geneva. Our focus is on promoting multi-stakeholder engagement on social issues, and we've been very supportive of both the work of the Global Compact as well as the guiding principles. And I would like to resonate with some of the remarks that were raised by our friend from UNEP, because I think the issue, as Ms. Mustafa has very eloquently elaborated regarding fragmentation, is an issue that should be addressed, and I hope you can, all of you, sort of comment on that. This is not only in terms of the environmental issues that are part of the Global Compact, and that do include elements that are very much oriented to human rights issues, but it also connects very much to the dilemma that I see often with regard to the combination of human rights with the workers' rights issues that are part of the Global Compact. There was an implication, I think, and Sir Mark Moody Stewart was one who implied this, that early on there was interest in the working conditions, and then moving beyond that to human rights. The implication, and I don't think he intended it, but the implication is that there's a difference. And certainly the incorporation of the working rights principles into the guiding principles, as well as part of the Global Compact as aspects of human rights, merits further scrutiny and some discussion about how you can effectively integrate those kinds of issues across the board. And I was especially impressed to hear from Ms. Winhoven that there will be a major role for the Global Compact in contributing the business perspective on the post-2015 development agenda. And it would suggest that the Global Compact should be playing a very crucial role in terms of the integration of the social, environmental, and economic priorities of human rights that are integrated into the 10 principles that are part of the Global Compact, but also in the guiding principles from the Human Rights Council.
Thank you very much. And now, from University of New Mexico, Mr. or Mrs. Gargas. Well, let's say Professor Gargas.
Thank you. My question is for Sir Moody Stewart. Very briefly, you mentioned that human rights was one of the most difficult for businesses to incorporate. I can't remember your phrasing exactly, and I just wonder, as an educator, is it because many people don't know how to define human rights? In America, most people haven't heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. So do we have a gap there?
Thank you. From the Office of the High Commissioner in Cambodia, Mr. or Mrs. Keats.
Hello, my name Bopal. I'm from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Cambodia.
Yes.
I just want to have some reflection on what we are doing in terms of capacity and building with regard to the guiding principle where the office in Cambodia has been doing, and we see the challenges ahead as well as how we can also integrate this implementation and promotion of the guiding principle among the UN agency at the country level. It has been not easier when we talk about only the human rights and business term, as in the local language there's already debate about using the term. So this is one of the main challenges at the moment, and we've been, because of the advantage of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Cambodia, we try to overcome this issue. But still, in terms of having other UN agency where there are more than 20 UN agency present in Cambodia, this really need a lot to be done in order to really get the agency to work and coordinate in coordinated ways. So I think the capacity building in the ground is really a big issue that it may need time, because for the time being, only what we say outreach awareness about this the principle, but the meaning of this itself, it's really difficult in this political environment in Cambodia. So there is something that all the UN agency need to have an effort and in a coordinated way in order to really promote the implementation or the guiding principle. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan Bird from the European Commission.
Over here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sue Bird from the European Commission, where I work with the Department for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. The European Commission is one of the institutions of the European Union. We are a curious setup in that we have three institutions altogether. We have the European Commission, which is the proposer of initiatives and legislation. We have the European Parliament, which is composed of the directly elected representatives, and then we have the European Council, where the ministers in the different policy areas come together. So in that context, I don't know whether we would be referred to in the global context as an international organisation or a regional organisation in the international context. But be it as it may, what I would be concerned about in this context that we're speaking about today is the interaction between ourselves and our sorting out our policy coherence and policy coordination in the different policy areas with the work of the UN institutions. And I'm very conscious also of Sir Mark's comments about the local impact, and it's the local impact which matters at the end of the day. And when you're working as an organisation which is working at some extraction from the local context, and also in a broader context of financial constraints, world, global, and particularly in the European context, a financial and economic crisis, then we're very conscious of needing to use public money in the wisest way possible. So what I would be concerned about is interlinking in the most efficient way with the work of the UN institutions and our own initiatives, and making sure we don't duplicate. So I'd appreciate any comments you have in those issues. Thank you.
Okay, and the last speaker for 1 minute, not more than 1 minute, is Kevin Cole from the Human Rights Treaties Division, who is going to very briefly address the issue of the Committee on the Rights of the Child.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We really appreciate having the floor for the next 55 seconds. Very, very briefly, thank you very much for the excellent panel presentations. It's extremely reassuring to see that we're all on the same page. I wanted to speak specifically to multiple points that were raised on the side of the floor as well as by the panel, specifically stating that the human rights treaty bodies, that's one crucial part, I think, of the UN system that hasn't been spoken to yet today, and yet is literally at the core of the system in terms of implementing the guiding principles. Speaking to the point that Heba brought up about the very real risk of fragmentation or whether it's fragmentation or interpretation, I can resoundingly reassure us all here that in the context of the treaty bodies, it's interpretation, it's coherent, strengthening interpretation. I wanted to specifically raise the fact that the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it's worth noting the CRC, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, has near universal ratification, 193 states parties. That's as close as it comes to a universally applicable, legally binding instrument that states parties have signed up to voluntarily. The committee is going to be, in March of next year, releasing its general comment on the impact of the business sector on the rights of the child. This has been consulted with extensively in-house with our colleagues at OHCHR dealing with this very successful forum here, as well as through them with the working group on business and human rights, you'll find that that's a pathway in terms of really getting a firm grasp of the role of the UN system in concretely applying the guiding principles coherently through a legally binding framework. I wanted to really, really raise that. Secondly, just as a closing footnote, the committee really has reviewed some 44 states parties on this issue since 2012. It is a series of issues that are also concerning the environment as well as the financial sector. Should any of you think that you have points, inputs that would be useful through this portal, really through applying the guiding principles in a binding framework, the email address, just so, because I'm out of time, is crc@ohchr.org. We'd be very, very happy to hear from any of the stakeholders here who think that they could use the CRC vis-à-vis its general comment and its regular monitoring of some 193 states parties. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll now give back the floor to the panelists, but really 1 minute each, so that we can be on time when it comes to the end of the session.
Yeah, sorry, it's always a pity because one has so many things one would like to say, and there's been a lot of very interesting points raised just on the interpretation fragmentation issue. I think that is it's a very real issue and a real concern, but I'm very pleased when UNICEF and the Global Compact and Save the Children were working on the children's principles. As far as the respect component of the principles, there were very close collaboration and a great understanding for the need to ensure that as far as these principles were concerned, speaking on children, there still needed to be alignment with the guiding principles where the two were overlapping. So I think that it can be done. It's quite labor intensive to do it, I think, for all parties involved. But I think that was a process that made that important point. And I think the guiding principles need to be applied and used in different sectoral contexts and in respect of different stakeholder groups. And one can do that. But the concern in doing that is if this alignment is not taking place. So it should be encouraged, but it does take work to ensure that it doesn't fragment. Just on the coordination issue, the report of the SGs deliberately did not propose an interagency committee. And I don't know how many colleagues are in the room who have experiences from interagency committees, but it wasn't just a purely selfish decision not to put that in, but instead doing the strategic point of saying this needs to be embedded in the coordination bodies that already exist. Because just like we're saying to companies, this issue doesn't belong in your CSR department, it belongs in your board, it belongs in all relevant parts, operational parts of your organization. The same thing with the business and human rights agenda. It's not a new freestanding agenda. The whole point is it needs to be embedded where decisions are made about all the issues that the UN is active in. So rather than having a freestanding coordination body, we opted for the embedding approach. Pillar 1, very important, Alex, and I think, and I was not referring to that, and I should have, that I think in terms of the UN's role at the country level, we are traditionally focused on, or by and large, on technical cooperation, technical assistance to governments, and indeed doing technical cooperation around Pillar 1 would and should be a very a key part of the thing. Just finally, on the extending of scope, what I didn't mean to say that we should now say that the guiding principles should be expanded per se, because I think we have the guiding principles, and I don't think we need to fiddle with them. But what I was suggesting was that the kind of approach and the kind of methodology and normative framing of issues that are embedded in the guiding principles are applicable across a number of different areas, including labor rights, which are indeed covered specifically by the guiding principles. It's the approach, it's the due diligence process that is, I think, applicable rather than saying now we take the guiding principles per se and expand them. Because that's not really possible, but there is no problem, I would think, and we have indeed worked with UNEP-FI on a number of, over a long time, in using the methodology. And so when you're doing your human rights work or other work in UNEP-FI, you use the methodology that is embedded in the guiding principles. I'll try to be.
Thank you. Sir Mark?
Thank you very much. Just a comment on high-level coordination. It would seem to me that the Office of the High Commission has a responsibility there, and failing them, the Secretary-General, he should add it to one of his to-do lists. I apologize, I didn't mention UNEP-FI, which is extremely important, and UNEP-FI, together with the Global Compact, set up the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is has 1,000 signatories of major fund managers with, I think, $30-something trillion under management. And they do try and progress the principles of the Global Compact and the guiding principles in their work. And we had a very successful meeting in London on just this week, supported by PRI and by investors, on investing in fragile states. And I've been on visits with investors through that to, for example, Sudan, and we discussed the evolving situation in Myanmar. The question of Professor Garblis on human rights and the problem business had initially, I think it's much better now, and the Ruggie work, I think, was extremely helpful to business, and his engagement with business, I think, did a great deal to clarify the situation. But the initial situation was, although people were used to the human rights in labor principles, which they didn't call human rights, if you said human rights to your average business person, they thought that meant Amnesty International, torture, prisoners of conscience, locking people up. We don't do that. It's nothing to do with us. And I think that we've kind of moved on from that, fortunately, and the Ruggie principles were extremely helpful in that. Lastly, just a comment on capacity building. I mean, it is capacity building needed both in local civil society and in governments, but also in businesses. And I go back to saying that the local networks, one of the deliveries of local networks are actually education and capacity building, mutual education from civil society to business and from business to civil society, from big business to smaller businesses. And it is very important because this is on the ground capacity building. And if you hear representatives of local networks, you will hear that very often they're extremely practical, but one of their attractions is that they haven't actually absorbed the language of you know, all the specialist terms. They actually talk about what really matters to them, and I think that's encouraging.
Thank you so much, and I'll start with the types of businesses that should be addressed, because there was a question about how the working group can address further the issue of accountability of businesses towards human rights abuses, and I believe we can widen the scope of the discussion maybe later as governments to give further mandate to the working group to work on these issues. If you look at the establishing resolution of the working group, you will see that in another paragraph we're speaking about not precluding or closing the door about the development of further standards in this regard to make them not necessarily more binding, but at least to address some sort of a protection gap that exists in international law as it stands now, that business or non-state actors are not held responsible in the same way states are for human rights violations / or quote-unquote abuses when it comes to business practices. On the issue of treaty bodies, and I would like to thank Kevin for the information he has given us, but just to remind all of us here that treaty bodies are treaty specific. So they are really bound, and their original mandate relates to the implementation of the treaties which they follow up in their dialogue with states. So as it says in the guiding principles that they are not new standards, but they are derived from existing human rights obligations on states, especially when it relates to the first and the third pillars. It starts with the state and ends with the state in terms of remedies and the protection sides. So it might be interesting that the treaty bodies can engage with states and be guided by the guiding principles in this regard, maybe to ask questions and to see if the states are aware of them and if they are taking care that they are in line with the guiding principles or not. About the fragmentation and the interpretation, I believe the report of the Secretary General mentions that there has been some sort of effort or activity by the Office of the High Commissioner to provide an interpretation of the guiding principles. I'm not 100% sure if this is work done. There is a report on this. Yeah, exactly. But the problematic here is that the guiding principles themselves were endorsed by states at the state level. So here at the Council and later at the General Assembly. So I believe that whatever interpretation will emerge, it has also to come to the states, because at the end of the day, we are holding two pillars of the three-pillared framework of the protect, respect, and remedy. So we have to be fully engaged in this process and see if the interpretation really works right with what we endorsed as guiding principles and if we can build on them. Thank you.
So I'm pleased the representative of Egypt has answered 75% of my question, what to do accountability. We need to work more with states. And then again, we've spent, those of us in the business and human rights space, we've spent the last years trying to understand how corporations work inside, right? Their decision-making processes inside, how the boards work, those who approve the finances, the operational projects, etc. And now that we have more clarity about that and how the guiding principles play within the different management systems of a company, we need to go back and plug that into the state. Market, social norms, and policy and regulation are what shapes corporate conduct. Those three things: market, social norms, and policy and regulation. So we're going to have to go back with that knowledge that we have about how corporations can do the guiding principles, how they make decisions, and plug that back into the state. And so we need to do more learning into the different options that states will have to shape, and society, to shape the market environment and shape corporate conduct.
Thank you very much. On the fragmentation topic, I think that the Global Compact and its ongoing collaboration with the High Commissioner's Office over the past 12 years is an important counter to the risk of fragmentation. In partnering with other UN entities, we've been championing the guiding principles among the UN's private sector focal points, for instance. And as Lene mentioned, the Children's Rights and Business Principles is a really nice example of that. I also agree with the point from the floor about the need to also guard against the risk of siloization between different dimensions of corporate sustainability, especially when it comes to the majority of businesses in the world which are SMEs. And given the interaction of these different dimensions, and I think the Global Compact brings these different dimensions together as an integrated value platform, and the benefit of that is being able to look at the interaction between issues like corruption and human rights and environment and human rights. And then just lastly, I would just say that that we actually have had about fortnightly interaction with the chair of the UN Working Group, because he was nominated as the member of the working group to interact with our office. So that's why we've been mostly interacting with him. But happy to interact with any others.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is an old UN story. I mean, I have myself been a UN functionary for 10 years. I was Assistant Director General of UNESCO in Paris. And I think in my 10 years that I have been working in UNESCO, we've had mainstreaming, integration, cooperation, duplication, capacity building in HIV/AIDS, in conflicts, in racism, in women, in human rights, in sustainable development, etc., etc. And we encounter always the same problems in terms of cooperation and coordination. But here, what makes it different is because the UN is now interacting with a new actor. Well, not new in the sense that business is not new, but it was not part of the UN interactions. The UN was first with member states when it was created, and then from 1989, 1990, we had all the NGOs, civil society organizations around the big UN World Conferences. So it opened a new era of interaction with civil society organizations, and now it is business, especially since 2000, because with globalization you have more and more power with business companies, and with power comes responsibility, starting with human rights. So I think the new element is not so much the mainstreaming of a new line of work and the cooperation around a new line of work. What is new is the new actor to which the UN has not been used to work with, and that is now opening new opportunities but challenges as well. So thank you very much for your patience, and we'll see you probably at another session before the end of the day. Thank you.